Folks, you are listening to the free version of the Ring of Fire Radio podcast. It's just about 50 minutes long, and you're missing out. What are you missing out on? You're missing out on more great interviews, more great analysis of the week's news. And more importantly, you're missing out on an opportunity to support independent media. We can't exist without your support. Head over to rofpodcast.com. Become a member today. We got a good discount if you buy a year-long membership, or you can pay just quarters a day. Pennies a day? I don't know. I can't do math as well as I can do politics, folks. So go over, check it out. And you also get access to our archives. We have some amazing interviews over the past, what is it now, decade? Check out rofpodcast.com. Support the show. Get as much Ring of Fire radio programming as you can. Thanks so much. Welcome to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Today on Ring of Fire Radio, Nancy Altman from Social Security Works will give us the history behind Medicare for All, why America is ready for universal health care. Ari Berman from Mother Jones will join us to discuss President Trump's latest meeting of his Election Integrity Committee, how they plan to make it harder for you to vote. Heather Digby Parton from Salon will be here to help break down the important news stories that you may have missed from this past week. And attorney Michael Bixby will join us to explain why the Equifax data breach can have serious implications for over 143 million Americans. Folks, don't forget you can go to rofpodcast.com and sign up for the free 1-hour version of Ring of Fire Radio podcast. And if you want the full show without commercials, become a member. It's the best way to support this show. That's rofpodcast.com. Here to help recap the week in news, Heather Parton from Salon, or as you may know her from her blog, Hullabaloo, Digby. So Heather, another week, and certainly this week has been a little bit off script, as it were. We are in the wake, I think, of still of the failure of the Republicans to pass a repeal and replace, and all of the sort of hostility between Donald Trump and Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan. I think we're seeing this past week and a half, we are seeing still the fallout from that. And there were two deals struck. I mean, and I guess we'll see how much the latter one sticks, between Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump. And the first was on the debt ceiling. That happened, I guess, towards the end of last week. And then midweek this week, or towards the end of this week, there was supposedly, and who knows what will happen to this agreement, a deal on a DACA, sort of a Dreamers Act. And before we get into sort of the more granular aspects of these deals, I mean, because we only know so much about them, but just broadly speaking, this raises sort of an interesting a question, doesn't it? And I have to say that, like, it occurred to me sometime earlier this week, like, what if the Democrats were to take the House? And I don't know, I mean, I think it's unlikely, but as a thought experiment, they were to take the Senate, and Donald Trump just in the next day said, you know what, I'm whatever you guys want, I'll sign it. And, what's going on here with these deal making of Donald Trump's?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think there are a number of dimensions to this. I've been writing a bit about it on Salon, and I'm still trying to sort it out. I mean, obviously, it's very confusing. This is different from politics as we've known it, even in this polarized age. And, of course, that's part and parcel of everything we've been through for the last 2 years. So, nothing new about the fact that everything's weird. But my take on it is a couple of things. First of all, I think you have to separate out the two deals. My personal belief is that the original deal that Trump made with the Democrats on the raising the debt ceiling and funding the disaster relief was really something that was approved of, perhaps not overtly and perhaps not even to Donald Trump, by McConnell and Ryan, because they had a total mess on their hands. Their agenda was a tremendous train wreck, and they had to get those things off the agenda. Those were urgent matters that had to be dealt with, and the crazies in the House were threatening a major fight over it. And I think that if Ryan and McConnell didn't approve of it in any public way or even tell Pelosi and Trump, I think they were relieved. Because I think at the end of that, I think that was something that allowed them to have a reset with their agenda, which is still a mess, by the way. I mean, there's still way too much, but they had to move some things off. And there was this argument that was developing, and then DACA came into it, and it was a big mess. So that was my take on it. I felt as if the Republican leadership was, at worst, I think they were relieved and, possibly even in on it. Now, I do also think, and I think one of the other strands of this, is that Trump really is mad at Ryan and McConnell. He feels that they've betrayed him and that they're not defending him, and a lot of that has to do with the Russia investigation. I think he feels that the Congress is letting him down by not exercising power that he believes they have to thwart this investigation. And you can kind of see little bits of activity around the edges that the Congress is doing, people like Nunes and some of these other, particularly House members who are kind of stepping up and, trying to throw in roadblocks where they can. That's what he wants them to do, and they're not doing it. So he's mad at them, and also the embarrassment of the failure of the Obamacare repeal. DACA, I think, is something different. Trump has got himself into a real corner here, and the Republicans have too, to be honest. I mean, DACA's popular. These dream kids. There's a large majority of the American public that wants a solution to this and wants them to be able to stay and, live their lives. And they see them as, even Steve Bannon says, well, they're culturally American, so they're fine with him. So, and yet at the same time, he's made a lot of promises, and the Republicans want to be able to use that in order to extract some concessions from Democrats and get them on board, just seeing as their crazies are probably going to demand more than they're going to be able to deliver, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a problem. And Trump, what he showed with his DACA, move, going for dinner with Pelosi and Schumer, and then Pelosi coming out afterwards and tweeting, "We solved it. We fixed it. The Dreamers are here to stay, and there won't be a wall. Yay! It's all great." Well, of course, the right wing exploded. And Trump he was doing it two-step for days, trying to figure out how to get himself out of it. I have no doubt that he did tell them that. That's his thing. He tells people what they want to hear. But he was outmaneuvered by them on a PR level because they raced out of the dinner and announced it as a big victory for the Democrats and raised the hopes, of course, of the DACA kids and of all the people who are working on that issue. So, he got himself into trouble with that one. But the dynamic still exists, this idea that I think there are these issues that we're talking about, DACA, the debt ceiling and disaster relief. These are things they have to do. They really don't have a choice. I mean, the Republicans cannot go again. I don't know what it's like 80% of the people do not want to see those kids deported. They just don't want to see it. So, the idea that they have to do these things, and the question is how they're going to get it done while soothing all the various factions involved in this. And Trump seems to have sort of stumbled into this kind of bipartisan method of doing it. And I don't think he did it through any strategic insight. I think it just sort of happened. He wants a win, and he's got to find a way to get one. But I think it's actually working okay for Republicans on those issues. Won't done anything else. If this happens, tax reform, he starts talking to Democrats about that, he's in big trouble with his base. But this I think may work. I shouldn't say with his base. I think his base is secure no matter what he does. I think they're called. I don't think they care. If Trump is for it, I think they're for it. But I'm talking about the larger Republican establishment. But it's a very, very interesting turn of events. And I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, I wonder, in 2018, if Trump says, the only way for me to win re-election is to switch parties, would his cult follow him? I kind of guess I kind of think they would.
They might.
And what do the Democrats do about the fact that you cannot ignore that Donald Trump is a white supremacist, authoritarian, right-winger? In all these other ways. Jeff Sessions is still the Attorney General, and
right.
Democrats had better be careful. They've got a base too, and at some point or another, this is going to clash.
Yeah, I think so. All right, well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue to talk about this because I have a slightly different perspective on part of your perception about that, on the part about that first deal, and similar thoughts about where. There are some possible pitfalls for Democrats going down the road. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. We're talking to the great Heather Parton. Hey, folks, on September 26th of this year, Mike Papantonio will be releasing a new book entitled Law and Vengeance. It's the follow-up to his critically acclaimed novel, Law and Disorder. The book is a legal and political thriller drawing on Pap's experience both as a skilled trial lawyer and as a nationally syndicated political talk show host. The story follows trial lawyer Gina Romano, who was first introduced in Law and Disorder, on her quest for both vengeance and justice in a whistleblower lawsuit against a weapons manufacturer who developed and sold a dangerously defective rifle scope. Pap has built a story around real-life events that he's encountered as one of the top trial lawyers in America, where he's been fighting some of the world's largest and most corrupt corporations. You can pre-order Mike Papantonio's new book, Law and Vengeance, today. Go to www.lawandvengeance.com. That's lawandvengeance.com. Check out the book, folks. I know you're going to love it. Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder here with Heather Digby Parton from Salon. So Heather, in the last segment we talked about, and we've got a lot of stuff to talk about this week, and atypical stuff for the Bush presidency. We're not talking this week about the president coming out and supporting neo-fascists. We're not talking about the president's administration falling apart. We're not talking about the president's administration supporting neo-fascists. We're not talking about the failure of Republicans to legislate. We are talking. Did I say Bush administration? Might as well. I said, but Trump administration. And we are talking about both the deal that Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer made with Donald Trump to basically punt the debt ceiling by 3 months as a way of also getting Hurricane Harvey support and funding passed as well. And you argued that this was probably a deal that either both made Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell happy, or one that they were also willing to sort of somewhat orchestrate. Now, I think it is the case that maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, we were talking about how September was going to be a meat grinder for the Republican Party. They had to authorize the national flood insurance. They had to reauthorize the FAA. They had to reauthorize children's health. They had until September 30th, according to the parliamentarian, to do a repeal and replace bill, which it seems to be is off the table for the most part, knock on wood. And they had this debt ceiling, and they had to fund, obviously, to provide some type of Harvey relief. And I have no doubt that Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan, on one hand, are like a little bit relieved that they're not going to have to deal with this because it would have been a meat grinder. But I think we have to remember that Paul Ryan, up until like hours, a couple of hours before Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer came out and announced they had a deal, thought that he had a deal. I mean, if he thought that it was going to go down, that Donald Trump was going to make a deal to just push the debt ceiling by 3 months, he certainly, I think he deserves an Emmy, because he was out a couple of hours earlier talking about how ridiculous the idea that you would push this off by 3 months was, and how despicable it was that you would do this. And I do think that there is a slow awareness amongst the Republican Party that we may want to put some distance between ourselves and Donald Trump, because 2018 could be a bit of a problem for us. But you know they can't do this, and they know they can't do it because their voters still are all Trump voters. You know, Donald Trump has 75% approval rating amongst Republicans. I would imagine if you were to drill down and look at specifically Congress people's seats and Senate people's seats where the Republicans hold it, that number is even higher. And people should remember, the Democratic Party approved of Barack Obama less in 2012 than Republicans approve of Donald Trump today. So I don't think they can escape Donald Trump, and I think it may have been one of those situations where they're like, let's look at let's make some lemon out of this, or lemonade out of this lemons. But nevertheless, how they felt about it is secondary to, what we've seen. I mean, the DACA deal, right, couldn't have happened unless Donald Trump made that first deal, it seems to me. And the DACA deal, knock on wood, it stays together, is a huge positive, just like a humanitarian positiveness. And I don't think that second one would have happened without the first.
Well, that's a good point. And you may be right. And I don't doubt that. I mean, to me, all those things are fine. I have my concerns about Democrats getting a little too celebratory and normalizing Trump as part of this process. However, on the merits of these particular events that they worked across the aisle with Trump, of course, they had to be done. I even argued in my Salon column that the wall was worth exchanging the wall for some kind of legalization for the Dreamers. And that's a big concession. But to me, it was like, all right, well, it'll be a Donald Trump development, so it'll fall down in a couple of years anyway. And, we can all stand on top of it like the Berlin Wall when he goes away and tears the thing down.
Bit by bit.
Yeah, exactly. But, whatever the case, I felt like, this is a humanitarian crisis for 800,000 Americans. I consider them Americans. They consider themselves Americans, and most decent people see them as Americans. And the idea that we would, that you would do this to these kids is horrifying. So, of course, I think Democrats enabling that in whatever way they can is
very
great.
Important.
And,
very
it's
important.
necessary.
Well, we got to take a break. Digby, if you'll join me in the next hour, we got a lot more to talk about, not the least of which is a single-payer health care bill that dropped this week. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. Heather Parton will be back with me in just in the next hour. This is Ring of Fire Radio. Coming up, voting rights expert Ari Berman on Trump's Election Integrity Committee. Why their meeting this week was a bad sign for American voters. I'm Sam Seder. You're listening to Ring of Fire Radio.
I'm a trial lawyer. I've spent countless hours pouring through documents that tell the story about the ugliest side of corporate America.
Fraud.
Corporate media refuses to talk about these issues.
The conduct by this company was deplorable.
I'm going to paint a clear picture about how disturbing, how corrupt corporate conduct has become in modern America. These are stories that no one else can tell. I'm Mike Papantonio, host of America's Lawyer. Question more.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. President Trump's Election Integrity Committee met earlier this week to suggest changes that could affect your voting rights. Here to tell us why you should be paying attention to this group, Ari Berman from Mother Jones Magazine. So, Ari, this has been a rather disturbing week from the perspective of voting rights in this country. We have both a ruling that is taking place in Texas, and then we have this ongoing so-called Election Integrity Commission that had its second hearing, if you will, up in New Hampshire. Tell us about that. What is the Election Integrity Commission?
So the Election Integrity Commission was founded after Donald Trump claimed with absolutely no evidence that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally. So Trump made this ridiculous statement. Everyone said he was false, but he's the president, so he could do what he wants. And he created a commission called the Presidential Commission on Election Integrity. And this has been controversial really from the very beginning. I mean, first off, you have all of Trump's lies about voter fraud. Then you have the fact the vice chair of the commission is Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach, who's probably the leading figure in the Republican Party when it comes to restricting voting rights and making crazy statements about voter fraud. And then when the commission started actually doing things, the first thing they did was to request the voter data of every American, which no presidential commission or no president has ever done before, which led to a lot of fears about how they would use that data if they were given it. And the controversy has kind of just continued since then. There have been at least 7 different lawsuits against the commission. Chris Kobach this week claimed that voter fraud tipped the election in New Hampshire, which there's absolutely no evidence of. There was a lot of crazy witnesses who made really radical ideas like requiring background checks for voting. So this commission has really been a disaster from the very beginning and continues to be so.
All right, I want to back up just a moment. The idea that this commission was solely a function of Donald Trump's delusion that there were 3 to 4 million fake votes so that he could make himself feel better about having not won the popular vote. To me, that's just a cover story. I mean, is there anything that has gone on that is in any way inconsistent with the long-term agenda? I mean, you're one of the premier experts, I think, on this in the country, frankly. This seems to me to be just the normal and I guess the natural, I want to say conclusion, I wish it was, but the natural or a denouement, if you will, of what the Republicans have been trying to do either in their states or nationally. I mean, this is part of their program.
Yeah, I mean, this is in many ways a defining feature of the Republican war on voting, which is you had Republicans in states across the country since the 2010 election pass new laws to make it harder to vote. You had the Supreme Court gut the Voting Rights Act in 2013. We just came out of an election that was the first presidential election in 50 years without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. We've had Republicans make crazy, unsubstantiated claims about voter fraud for years, and all of that culminated with the forming of this commission. And I think what they're going to do is they're going to lie about voter fraud, not just Donald Trump's lie about 3 to 5 million people voting illegally, but all sorts of other lies. And then they're going to use those lies as evidence of massive voter fraud, and they're going to then try to put in place policies that further restrict voting rights. So we've already seen this at the state level, but to me, what's so disturbing about this commission is they're going to try to do what they've already done at the state level and export it, not just to more states, but try to do it on a federal level nationally as well, where you have the Justice Department getting involved, you have them making recommendations to states and Congress, you have them doing things at the administrative level, all of which is just an escalation of an already existing suppression agenda.
And I want to go through what they've done in the states, like how they go about disenfranchising voters. But I just want to make a point here of saying to our audience, this is why this is so important, is because this so-called Election Integrity Commission is being designed as a fig leaf, as an excuse for them to implement policies that will disenfranchise voters. I mean, Ari, I know you remember during the Bush administration, the big controversy about the firing of the U.S. attorneys around the country because Karl Rove was adamantly trying to get proof of voter fraud so that they could justify disenfranchising more voters. And even you had longtime U.S. attorneys who were like, look, if there was any, I would bring it to you, but I don't have it, and they'd get fired. And this is just the next step, it seems to me, in that agenda. I mean, we can go this week. There were emails that were uncovered between the Heritage Foundation and the administration that between, frankly, guys who ended up on the Election Integrity Commission basically saying you can't have any Democrats and you can't have any moderate Republicans on this commission because it's going to interfere with our agenda.
Yeah, I mean, this email was really remarkable. And you mentioned the Bush administration, and the person who wrote this email was Hans von Spakovsky of the Heritage Foundation, who was really the leading figure in the Bush administration, in the Bush Justice Department, when it came to restricting voting rights. And so von Spakovsky does all of this stuff in the Bush administration. Then he goes to the Heritage Foundation, and he's lobbying to get put on this Election Integrity Commission. But even more than that, he writes a letter which is forwarded to Attorney General Jeff Sessions that says that they need to include Democrats, that they need to include not just moderate Republicans, but what he called mainstream Republicans. So I take that as any Republican, almost every Republican Secretary of State, save for Chris Kobach, would be considered a mainstream Republican. So they don't want any Republican secretaries of state on the commission. They don't want any academics on the commission. So anyone who studied the problem of voter fraud is off it too. And you could see that this thing from the very, very beginning, the fix was in, that this was always going to be about pushing this narrative of widespread voter fraud to then lay the groundwork for massive voter suppression. That the people on the commission have a very long history of doing that, whether it's Chris Kobach in Kansas or whether it's Hans von Spakovsky in the Bush Justice Department. But now they're all together in one place. And I worry that even though this commission is viewed as illegitimate by a lot of people, just by virtue of being a presidential commission, some people are going to take it seriously, and they're going to start to normalize more and more crazy ideas.
That is exactly my concern too, and it's the reason why we have you on here. If people go and check out, I mean, the list of people who are on this commission, the Democrats on this commission are literally county officials. County officials in from I think West Virginia and maybe Montana, who are sitting there. They're on a 10-person commission with the Vice President of the United States and with Chris Kobach, who is part of the president's transition team. They are handpicked because they're going to be amenable to this, but they're also there because they don't have the heft, frankly, to come out. No one is going to listen to the press conference from the county election official from West Virginia who sat on this commission and thought the whole process was bunk at the end of this day. The headline is going to be, commission finds this, this type of voting fraud. All right, well, listen, all right, we got to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk about specifically this New Hampshire claim, and I want to talk about what they've done in the states that they want to replicate in across the country. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio. I'm talking to the great Ari Berman. We'll be right back after this. Folks, the Ring of Fire is sponsored by JustCoffee.coop. That's JustCoffee.coop. If you like fair trade, delicious coffee, tea, or chocolate, head over to JustCoffee.coop. Use the coupon code MAJORITY and get 10% off. There's free shipping. You have no reason not to get this great coffee. It's a great outfit in Madison, Wisconsin, which supported the protests there. JustCoffee.coop. We're back on Ring of Fire Radio. I'm Sam Seder. Right now I'm talking with Mother Jones contributor Ari Berman of President Trump's Election Integrity Committee. Ari, we were talking in the last segment about this Election Integrity Commission and its purpose as a fig leaf in many respects to essentially scale up what folks like Chris Kobach, the vice chair of this commission, have done in their own state, he in particular in Kansas. Before we get to what they did there, and before we get to this ruling in Texas, which I imagine you find rather disturbing, as I do, they were in New Hampshire this past week. What is the big lie about New Hampshire they're trying to sell? I mean, this is sort of like, this is their rolling out of their product, it seems to me, and they want to try and see, like, what's the best way to market this?
So what Kobach was arguing, and he argued it in a Breitbart column, and we'll talk about that in a second, but what Chris Kobach said, he pointed to some numbers that were released by the New Hampshire Speaker of the House that found that 6,000 people had voted on Election Day using out-of-state driver's licenses as proof of ID. And they found that very few of those people had subsequently registered their cars in the state or had obtained a New Hampshire driver's license. And Kobach said that was proof, in his words, of voter fraud, and that potentially had tipped the election against Trump and Kelly Ayotte, the GOP Senate candidate in the state. Now, there was a much, much simpler explanation for what happened, which is that it's legal to vote in New Hampshire with an out-of-state driver's license. This is not fraud. This is just people using one of the acceptable forms of ID in New Hampshire. Moreover, there are all sorts of reasons why someone in New Hampshire might still have an out-of-state driver's license. Maybe they're a college student, and indeed many college students came forward and said that they're from other states and they go to school in New Hampshire, they wanted to vote there, which is perfectly legal. Or maybe they don't drive. Or maybe, like thousands of other Americans, they don't update their driver's license when they immediately move to a state. So there was no evidence of fraud. And it was interesting because when Kobach made this claim at the meeting of the Election Integrity Commission in New Hampshire, he was rebuked by New Hampshire Secretary of State, who I am not that fond of, quite frankly, but who at least at this point stood up to Kobach and said he had no idea what he was talking about. This was not evidence.
I mean, how could you get away with not doing that anyways? It's perfectly legal to vote. He's saying this legal act is proof that an illegal act took place.
Basically, that's what he was saying. And this thing was so easy to debunk. I mean, I've sifted through a lot of different lies that Chris Kobach has made, and this one was so easy to debunk. And it was also just notable that he made it in Breitbart News because Kobach revealed that he's a paid columnist for Breitbart.
What?
At
Is that right?
At the same time, he is Kansas Secretary of State, he's running for governor of Kansas, and he's leading this Election Integrity Commission. So ethics lawyers believe that this arrangement violates federal conflict of interest laws.
Wow.
But the bigger picture is he is now a columnist for the so-called platform for the alt-right and is getting paid for it. And I think that just kind of tells you everything you need to know about this guy.
Well, there's a whole nother story here, too, it seems to me, is that as easy it is to debunk Chris Kobach's charge that something that is legal is not necessarily illegal. A lot of people won't hear that. They're just going to read his piece in Breitbart, and I got to imagine that Chris Kobach, as an opinion columnist, does not feel an obligation to put in a correction as he does that. All right. Well, all right. So
yeah, and
so
Breitbart isn't exactly the New York Times when it comes to journalistic ethics, but you're absolutely right. I looked at his story. It had 28,000 shares on Facebook. So obviously a lot of people were reading it. The Drudge Report put it out. All sorts of people in New Hampshire were tweeting it. Short of Donald Trump tweeting it, this thing got a lot of attention, and a lot of people are going to believe it. It was on Fox News, and this is the kind of stuff I worry about, Sam, is, again, normalizing things that we know are factually inaccurate, that are easily debunked, but people are going to think they're true just because someone says it.
I said this in the last segment. There's very few issues out there that are more sensitive to the public perception than this one. And this is why these type of claims need to be refuted, because this is what they're constructing is just a massive fig leaf so they can disenfranchise voters. How would they go about doing that? Let's say they build this record of a voter ID fraud in New Hampshire and whatever they come up with next in the next stop on their dog and pony show. How do they then go about disenfranchising voters?
Well, they basically do what they've already done on the state level, but more aggressively. They pass strict voter ID laws, so people that don't have those forms of ID can't cast a ballot. They eliminate opportunities that make it easier to vote, like same-day registration, which lead to higher turnout. They purge the voting rolls in inaccurate and discriminatory ways so that Democratic-leaning voters in minority neighborhoods have their names taken off the rolls. They show up to vote and they find that they're no longer registered and they can't do anything about it. They cut back early voting, so there are longer lines. They close polling places so people don't know where to vote. These are all things. They just exclude classes of voters altogether, like in Florida, where they prevented ex-felons from voting even after they'd served their time. I mean, these are all things we've seen states do, whether it's in North Carolina or Texas or Wisconsin. But they want to see more of this stuff done, and they want to see it done at the federal level in addition to the state level, and they want to see the administration, like the Justice Department, be more aggressive in doing these kind of things. So the Justice Department, for example, has already asked states how they are purging their voting rolls, which is probably a precursor to the Justice Department suing states to force them to purge their voting rolls. The Justice Department has already decided to drop its opposition to voter ID laws, drop opposition to voter purging before the Supreme Court. And this kind of stuff matters because the courts take seriously what the federal government is doing. So all of this stuff is things that's already happening, but it's just they're going to try to escalate that strategy.
All right, listen, we just have about 90 seconds left. Part of the harbinger for these moves, of course, was the Supreme Court gutting the pre-clearance process in the Voting Rights Act, which you've written extensively about. There was a case in Texas this week that the Supreme Court weighed in on. Tell us about that. We just got about 90 seconds.
So the lower courts ruled that Texas redistricting maps for both Congress and for the state legislature are intentionally discriminatory against Black and Latino voters, and they order that new districts need to be drawn. The Supreme Court stayed that ruling, meaning that there will not be new districts drawn anytime soon, even though a federal court has already found that these districts are intentionally discriminatory. This is both a loss for minority voters and for basic representation. It's also a victory for the Republican Party because more than likely in 2018, they can run for re-election in these districts that they gerrymandered in intentionally discriminatory ways. And this was a 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court. I tweeted that I believe that Mitch McConnell stealing a Supreme Court seat from President Obama will end up being the most consequential action of Donald Trump's presidency. And I think we're seeing that play out today.
Without a doubt. And it's shocking to me that that after basically a ruling in that Voting Rights Act that racism was not in play, that they could turn around and look at, and they don't do any finding of fact. The court already found that it was done with racist outcomes and perhaps even maybe intent, but they would just do that. It's Elections matter, folks. Ari Berman, I appreciate your time today.
Thanks a lot, Sam.
Ari Berman is a senior reporter at Mother Jones Magazine covering voting rights and a reporting fellow at the Nation Institute. He's the author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. When we come back, Heather Digby Parton will help us analyze more of the news from this past week. That's just ahead. I'm Sam Seder. You're listening to Ring of Fire Radio. Don't forget, check out rofpodcast.com to support the show and catch up on what you missed.